Mike had always dreamed of living by the water. Not some fancy mansion with marble floors and golden taps, but just a simple cabin where he could watch the sun rise over the lake each morning. For 15 long years, he put away a chunk of his paycheck each month, skipped vacations, and drove the same old car even when the air conditioning stopped working 3 summers ago. Every sacrifice was worth it for that little piece of peace he'd been chasing. The day he got the keys to his cabin on Lake Clearwater felt like the first real day of his life after a rough few years. His divorce had left him feeling hollowed out, like someone had scooped away parts of who he was. The cabin was his chance to fill those spaces with something new. The community is real friendly, the real estate agent had told him, flashing a bright smile. Just the usual rules about keeping your grass cut and not painting your house neon green. She laughed at her own joke, and Mike smiled politely. What she didn't tell him was that 2 months before he moved in, the Clearwater Shores community had elected a new head of their homeowners association. Her name was Diane, though most people now called her HOA Karen when she wasn't around to hear it. Diane had moved to Clearwater Shores after retiring as a big shot at some corporate office in the city. She wore designer clothes that looked oddly out of place on the wooden docks and dirt paths around the lake. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, even on the muggiest summer days when everyone else's hair frizzed and curled. "I've got big plans for this place," she'd announce at community meetings, standing tall in her expensive shoes. "In 3 years, your homes will be worth 3 times what they are now." Some folks nodded along, dreams of retirement money dancing in their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, wondering if they'd still be able to afford living there if her plans went through. Mike's first real run-in with Diane happened just 3 weeks after he moved in. He'd spent the weekend setting up his pride and joy in the side yard, a 1962 wooden sailboat that he'd been restoring for nearly 4 years. The Weekend Wanderer, he called her. The boat wasn't anything fancy by rich people standards, but to Mike she was perfect. 18 feet of hand-sanded wood with a fresh coat of marine varnish that gleamed honey gold in the sunlight. He was adding the final touches to the boat stand when a shadow fell across the wood. He looked up to see Diane standing there, a clipboard hugged to her chest and oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes. "That can't stay there," she said without even saying hello first. Mike wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up. "Nice to meet you too. I'm Mike, just moved in." Diane looked at him like he was being difficult on purpose. "I know who you are. I'm Diane Holloway, president of the Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing she was the Queen of England. "Well, Diane, I checked the community rules before I set up my boat. Watercraft under 20 feet can be stored on private property as long as they're on proper stands and maintained." Mike had actually read all 37 pages of the community guidelines, which he figured put him ahead of most residents. Diane's mouth tightened into a thin line. "That may be what the current rules say, but that eyesore doesn't fit with the community aesthetics we're developing." She waved her hand as if shooing away a fly. "We're creating a premium lakeside experience here, not a boat junkyard." Mike felt his face getting hot. The Weekend Wanderer wasn't an eyesore. He'd poured hundreds of hours into restoring her. Every piece of brass had been polished until it shone like gold. Every inch of wood had been lovingly repaired and sealed. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice friendly, "I understand you have a vision for the community, but my boat is completely within the current rules. I've got the right to keep it here." Diane lowered her sunglasses just enough to look at him over the rims. Her eyes were pale blue and cold as lake water in winter. "Rules," she said with a smile that didn't reach those icy eyes, "can change when they need to." The next morning, Mike found a violation notice stuck to his front door. The day after that, another one. They kept coming, each printed on paper that seemed more official than the last. Some mentioned his boat. Others found issues with the height of his grass or the positioning of his trash cans. His next-door neighbor Tom stopped by one evening as Mike was sorting through the growing pile of notices. "She's just trying to scare you," Tom said, leaning against the porch railing. He was a retired teacher who'd lived at Clearwater Shores for over a decade. "She's doing it to everyone who doesn't fit her country club vision." "Can she really change the rules just like that?" Mike asked. Tom sighed, looking out toward the lake where the water had turned purple in the evening light. "She's sneaky about it." Gets her friends on the board to vote her way. Schedules meetings when working folks can't attend. He shook his head. Been getting worse since she took over. Mike folded the latest notice and slid it back into its envelope. He'd worked too hard and waited too long for his peaceful lake life. He wasn't about to let someone like Diane take it away, no matter how many notices she left on his door. What he didn't know then, couldn't have known, was just how far Diane would go to get her way. The notices were just the beginning. Soon, the fight over a wooden boat would turn into something much darker than he could have imagined. As fall turned to winter and winter slowly melted into spring, Mike watched Diane's influence grow like a shadow over the community. She'd added 2 of her close friends to the HOA board, a retired banker named Harold who followed her around like an obedient dog, and Patricia, who owned 3 rental properties in the area and cared only about maximizing her investment. The HOA meetings, once friendly gatherings with homemade cookies and casual conversations, now felt more like walking into a courtroom where you were already guilty. Mike started attending every meeting, sitting quietly in the back row, taking notes on his phone. "We need to present a unified community aesthetic," Diane would say, clicking through PowerPoint slides showing fancy lakeside communities from magazines. "Property values are our top priority. Whenever someone raised a concern about rising HOA fees or stricter rules, Diane would cut them off mid-sentence. 'Let's stay focused on the agenda,' she'd say sharply. Or worse, 'Perhaps you'd like to volunteer for the beautification committee if you have so many opinions.' People learned quickly that questioning Diane meant getting assigned to pointless committees or finding yourself the target of sudden, routine inspections. By April, the community had split into 2 groups. There were those who supported Diane, mostly newer residents who'd bought in at higher prices and wanted to protect their investment, or older folks who were planning to sell soon and liked the sound of tripling their home value. Then there were the others, the young families, the retirees on fixed incomes, the people who'd lived there for decades, who just wanted to enjoy their homes without someone measuring their grass with a ruler. Mike decided it was time to meet the other people who saw through Diane's act. He printed up some simple flyers inviting neighbors over for a cookout. Nothing fancy, just burgers, some cold drinks, and a chance to talk without Diane hovering nearby. He was careful with the wording, making it just a friendly gathering, not an anti-Diane meeting. The cookout was a success. About 20 neighbors showed up bringing side dishes and 6-packs of beer. For the first time since moving in, Mike felt like he was part of a real community. People shared stories about living at the lake, fishing, tales, memories of summer storms, the year the whole cove froze solid and everyone went ice skating. As the evening wrapped up and people headed home, Mike felt hopeful. He wasn't alone in wanting to preserve the laid-back spirit of Clearwater Shores. That feeling lasted exactly 12 hours. When Mike got home from work the next day, a thick envelope was waiting for him. Inside was a certified letter on official HOA letterhead. It informed him that the board had held an emergency meeting the previous night, right during his cookout, and had passed a new rule specifically banning all watercraft storage visible from any community area, road, or neighbor's property. The letter gave him 30 days to remove his boat or start paying daily fines of $100. It was signed by Diane, with a yellow sticky note attached that simply said, "Rules change." Mike's hands were shaking as he read it. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. This was personal. He called Tom, who had been at the cookout. "Did you know about any emergency meeting last night?" "First I'm hearing of it," Tom said. "They're required to post notice of all meetings at least 7 days in advance. Even emergency ones need 48 hours unless there's a safety issue." Mike sat down at his kitchen table and pulled up the HOA bylaws on his laptop. He'd already read them once, but now he studied them line by line, taking notes on legal requirements for meetings, voting procedures, and rule changes. The next morning, he called a lawyer named Lisa who specialized in HOA disputes. She wasn't cheap, $300 for the initial consultation, but Mike knew he needed professional help. Lisa listened carefully, asked to see copies of all the notices and the new rule, and then smiled for the first time. They messed up. she said. Multiple procedural violations, insufficient notice. No quorum present based on who you say was at your cookout. Impar. What are you doing on my property? Mike demanded, slamming his car door. Diane looked startled, then quickly composed herself. Conducting an official inspection, she said coolly. The bylaws allow the board to inspect properties for rule violations. With proper notice, Mike countered, which I didn't receive. This is trespassing. Harold, a thin man with nervous eyes, started edging toward the street. Patricia, round-faced and defiant, stood her ground next to Diane. We don't need notice for complaints about hazardous conditions, Diane said smugly. What hazardous conditions? Mike asked. We received an anonymous complaint that your boat might be leaking fuel or chemicals, Diane replied. As board president, I have a duty to investigate immediately. It was such an obvious lie that Mike almost laughed. My boat hasn't been fueled in weeks. It's a sailboat and there are no chemicals on board. Well, we'll need to verify that, Diane insisted. She took another picture. Get off my property, Mike said, pulling out his phone. Now, or I'm calling the sheriff. Patricia stepped forward. You're making a big mistake, fighting the board like this. We have resources you can't imagine. Is that a threat? Mike asked, already dialing. It's a reality check, Diane cut in. Come along, Patricia, Harold. We have what we need for now. To Mike, she added, you'll be hearing from us. They left. But Mike's sense of violation remained. They had been on his property, touching his things, probably looking for any small issue they could use against him. It made his skin crawl. That afternoon, when he met with Lisa, he brought the full log of incidents. She read through it with a deepening frown. This goes beyond typical HOA overreach, she said. This is coordinated harassment. The good news is they're making mistakes. The unauthorized inspection today, the illegal tow attempt, these are actionable. What does that mean? Mike asked. It means we can fight back, Lisa said, leaning forward. I suggest we file a formal complaint with the state's housing authority, and we should consider a restraining order against Diane personally. For the first time in weeks, Mike felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way to end this nightmare without losing his home or his boat. What he didn't know was that Diane had already set in motion a plan that would take their conflict to a dangerous new level, one that would leave his beloved boat in ashes and change the community of Clearwater Shores forever. For the next several days, Mike's house became a hub of activity. Police officers came and went, collecting evidence and taking statements. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles, coffee, and offers of support. The destruction of his boat had turned Mike from that difficult guy with the eyesore into a victim of a vicious crime that had shaken the entire community. The most surprising visitor arrived on Tuesday afternoon. Beth Wilson had been on the HOA board for nearly 5 years, usually voting with Diane on most issues. She looked nervous as Mike invited her inside. I need to tell you something, she said, sitting stiffly on the edge of his couch. But first I need your word that you won't tell anyone it came from me. Mike nodded, curious about what could have brought one of Diane's allies to his door. Beth pulled a small USB drive from her purse. This has emails and financial records from the HOA board's private communications over the past 2 years. Her voice shook slightly. I never signed up for burning people's property or breaking the law. Why are you giving this to me? Mike asked. Because after what happened to your boat, I looked back through our email exchanges. There are things in here that... She paused, choosing her words carefully. That show this wasn't a spontaneous act. Diane has been talking about making an example of someone for months. When you moved in with that wooden boat she called a floating dumpster, you became the target. Mike took the USB drive, turning it over in his hand. Did she explicitly say she was going to burn my boat? Beth shook her head. Nothing that direct, but there's an email where she wrote, sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. Better to lose one small boat than have the whole neighborhood look like a marina. That was after you announced you'd run for the board. A chill ran down Mike's spine at the casual cruelty of the statement. Thank you for this. he said quietly. After Beth left, Mike plugged the drive into his laptop. What he found was more damning than he'd expected. Years of manipulated meeting minutes. Financial records showing HOA funds spent on Diane's pet projects without proper authorization. Emails discussing how to force out undesirable residents. Through targeted enforcement and harassment, he immediately called Lisa. "This is gold," his lawyer said after Mike forwarded her the files. "Combined with the security footage and the arson investigation, we've got enough to go nuclear." "What does that mean exactly?" Mike asked. "It means we don't just fight the HOA on the boat rule anymore," Lisa explained. "We file formal complaints with the State Housing Authority for discrimination and financial misconduct. We provide evidence to the police for their arson investigation, and most importantly, we invoke the nuclear option in your HOA's founding documents, which is a special provision that allows the homeowners to vote to temporarily suspend the entire board pending an investigation if there's evidence of gross misconduct or dereliction of duty. It's rarely used, but it exists specifically to prevent the kind of takeover Diane has orchestrated." For the first time since his boat burned, Mike felt a spark of hope. "So we could actually remove her from power?" "Not just her, the entire board," Lisa confirmed. "But we'll need signatures from at least 25% of homeowners to call the special meeting." Getting those signatures became Mike's mission. He started with the neighbors who'd been supportive after the fire. Tom helped by approaching people who might be uncomfortable talking directly to Mike. Slowly, the list grew. Some people signed eagerly, sharing their own stories of run-ins with Diane. Others were more hesitant, worried about retaliation. A few flat out refused, still believing Diane's vision would increase their property values enough to justify her methods. While the signature campaign progressed, the police investigation into the boat fire continued. The officer in charge, Detective Rivera, stopped by Mike's house regularly with updates. "We found traces of the accelerant on a raincoat in Ms. Holloway's garage," she told Mike during one visit. "Not enough for an arrest yet, but enough to get a warrant for more electronic evidence. We're building a solid case." 10 days after the fire, Mike was removing the last of the boat's charred frame when a sleek black car pulled up. A man in an expensive suit got out and approached. "Mr. Jensen, I'm Robert Keller, representing Diane Holloway." He offered a business card that identified him as a partner at a prestigious law firm. "My client would like to resolve this unfortunate situation amicably." Mike crossed his arms. "By situation, do you mean the illegal harassment or the arson?" The key lawyer's expression didn't change. "My client denies any involvement in the fire. However, she recognizes that community relations have become strained. She's prepared to offer a settlement." "I'm listening," Mike said, though he had no intention of settling. "The HOA will drop all pending fines against your property and amend the watercraft storage rule to grandfather in your replacement boat should you choose to get one. In exchange, you'll drop all complaints against the board and sign an NDA about this matter." Mike almost laughed at the audacity. "Your client burns down my boat, and her solution is to let me get another one without harassment? That's not a settlement offer. That's an admission of guilt with a bribe attached." The lawyer's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Mr. Jensen, litigation can be lengthy and expensive, even with insurance. My client is offering a clean resolution." "Tell your client I'll see her in court, and at the special board suspension meeting next week," Mike replied. "I already have enough signatures." The lawyer's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, Diane hadn't known about the suspension petition. "I strongly advise you to reconsider," he said, voice hardening. "Ms. Holloway has considerable resources and connections." "So do I," Mike said, thinking of the growing support in the community, the evidence in his possession, and the ongoing police investigation. "And mine are all legal." After the lawyer left, Mike called Lisa to tell her about the settlement offer. She wasn't surprised. "It means they're scared," she said. "Keep collecting signatures for the meeting. I'll handle the legal notices and paperwork." By the end of the week, Mike had signatures from 32% of Clearwater Shore's homeowners. More than enough to trigger the special meeting. Lisa filed the required notices, and the meeting was set for the following Thursday evening at the community center. The night before the meeting, Mike couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, looking out at the empty space where his boat had once been. The weekend wanderer was gone forever, but its destruction had revealed the rot at the heart of Clearwater Shores, rot that he now had a chance to cut out. His phone pinged with a text message. It was from an unknown number. Check your email. In his inbox, Mike found a message from Teresa, another former board member who'd resigned months ago after clashing with Diane. The email contained dozens of screenshots of private HOA board text messages where Diane and her allies discussed how to handle the boat situation and make sure the message is received loud and clear. While none of the messages explicitly mentioned burning the boat, the timing and context made their intentions clear. In one exchange just days before the fire, Diane had written, "Problem situations require problem solving. Sometimes action speaks louder than rules." Mike forwarded everything to Lisa and Detective Rivera, then tried again to sleep. Tomorrow would be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the future of Clearwater Shores and whether justice would finally catch up with HOA Karen, who thought burning a boat would strengthen her power, not destroy it. "Remember," Lisa said as they worked, "tonight isn't a trial. We're not proving Diane committed arson. That's for the police. We're showing the community that the board has abused its power and violated its duties." Mike nodded, sorting photos of his burned boat into a folder. "Do you think people will actually vote to suspend them?" Lisa looked up from her laptop. "People are angry, Mike. Not just about your boat, but about years of bullying. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up first." By 6 o'clock that evening, cars lined the streets around the community center. Mike had never seen so many neighbors in one place. There were even people he didn't recognize, residents who normally avoided community events entirely. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation that instantly hushed when Mike walked in with Lisa. Some people nodded encouragingly. Others looked away uncomfortably. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up for the board members, with Diane's usual seat in the center, like a throne. Mike took a seat in the front row, despite his instinct to hide in the back as usual. Lisa sat beside him, professional in a navy suit, her tablet ready with all their evidence. At exactly 7 p.m., the side door opened and Diane walked in, followed by the rest of the board members. Her silver hair was perfect as always, her expression calm and confident as she surveyed the packed room. If she was worried about the unusual turnout, she didn't show it. "Good evening," she began, tapping the microphone. "I see we have quite a crowd tonight. Before we get to the special agenda item, we'll cover regular business first." Lisa stood up immediately. "Point of order, Ms. Holloway. Under Article C, or Section 9 of the bylaws, a special meeting called by petition must address the petition items first before any other business." Diane's smile tightened. "I'm aware of the bylaws, Ms. Jacobson," Lisa supplied. "Attorney for Mike Jensen." "Oh," murmur ran through the crowd. Diane hadn't expected Mike to bring legal representation. "Very well," Diane said after a moment. "We'll address the petition." She looked directly at Mike. "Mr. Jensen has called this meeting to discuss what he calls misconduct by the board. I assure you all, everything we've done has been for the betterment of Clearwater Shores and within our authority as elected representatives." Mike stood up, heart pounding. He'd practiced what he would say, but facing the entire community, and Diane's cold stare, was intimidating. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm not great at public speaking, so I'll keep this simple. This meeting isn't really about my boat, though that's what brought us here. It's about how this board has been running our community." He took a deep breath and continued. "When I moved here last year, I was looking for peace and a fresh start. Instead, I found a homeowners association that uses fear and intimidation rather than fairness and transparency." For the next 15 minutes, Mike laid out the evidence they'd gathered. He explained how board meetings were scheduled when working residents couldn't attend, how rules were selectively enforced against people who questioned Diane, how HOA funds were spent on projects that primarily benefited board members' properties. Throughout his presentation, Diane's expression remained neutral, though Mike noticed, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her pen. When Mike mentioned the financial irregularities, the consultant fees paid to Diane's daughter, the landscaping services that somehow only benefited certain homes, Harold, one of the board members, began to look distinctly uncomfortable. But the final straw, Mike continued, wasn't just the destruction of my property. It was finding out that this wasn't a one-time thing, that intimidation and threats have been standard practice under this board. He projected an email onto the screen at the front of the room. It was from Diane to the other board members, dated just 2 weeks before his boat burned. The message read, "Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. Better to lose one small boat than have the whole neighborhood look like a marina." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Diane shot to her feet. "That email has been taken completely out of context," she snapped. "I was referring to towing, not whatever you're implying." Lisa stood smoothly. "We have the full email chain, Ms. Holloway. The context is quite clear, especially when combined with the security footage from the night of the fire." At this, Patricia, another board member, visibly paled and whispered something to Diane, who silenced her with a glare. Mike continued, "I'm not here asking for money or revenge. I'm asking to invoke Article 12 of our founding documents, which allows homeowners to temporarily suspend the board pending an investigation when there's evidence of misconduct." Lisa took over, explaining the legal details of the provision and the voting process. When she finished, Diane stood again, her composure cracking slightly. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Mr. Jensen moved in and immediately began violating community standards. When we enforced those standards, he started a vendetta against this board. Now he's trying to take over the HOA because he couldn't be bothered to follow simple rules about his eyesore of a boat." Mike expected angry murmurs at this, but the room remained silent, watching. An older man near the back finally raised his hand. Mike recognized him as Bill, who'd lived at Clearwater Shores for over 20 years. "Diane," Bill said, his voice carrying clearly, "my wife and I have lived here since before you arrived. This used to be a friendly place where neighbors helped each other. Now people are afraid to put out the wrong color flower pots." He paused. "I don't know who burned Mike's boat, but I know that's not the community I want to live in." A woman on the other side of the room spoke up next. "My son wanted to put up a basketball hoop last summer. You told me it would degrade the visual aesthetic and find me when I did it anyway. He's 12. Where's he supposed to play?" Suddenly, more people began sharing their stories. Rain gutters painted the wrong shade of white, fines for leaving garbage cans out a few hours too long, threatening letters about holiday decorations. With each new story, the atmosphere in the room shifted further. These weren't just Mike's complaints anymore, they were the community's. Diane tried several times to regain control of the meeting, but the dam had broken. Years of resentment poured out from residents who'd been too intimidated to speak up before. Finally, when the stories wound down, Lisa called for the vote. Under Article 12, she explained, a 2/3 majority of homeowners present can vote to temporarily suspend the board pending a full investigation. If the vote passes, a property management company will handle essential HOA functions until the investigation is complete. The voting was done by paper ballot, with 2 neutral residents counting. Mike's stomach churned as the ballots were collected and counted. Diane sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask. When the counts were finalized, one of the counters stood up. The results are 87 votes to suspend the board, 12 votes against suspension, 3 abstentions. That's 85%. In favor, well above the required 2/3. The room erupted in applause. Mike felt a wave of relief so powerful he had to grip his chair to stay upright. He'd done it. They'd done it. Diane stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. For a moment, she looked like she might challenge the results or make a scene. Then, without a word, she gathered her expensive handbag and walked out, followed by most of the board members. Only Harold remained, looking lost. He approached Mike after the meeting as people were filing out. "I didn't know about the boat. he said quietly. I swear, I just went along with everything because, well, Diane can be very convincing. Mike nodded, not sure what to say. Harold had been part of the problem, but he also seemed genuinely shaken by how far things had gone. As Mike walked home that night, the weight that had pressed on his shoulders for months finally began to lift. His boat was gone, but something important had been saved, the soul of the community he'd chosen as his home. 6 months had passed since the night Mike's boat burned. Spring had given way to summer, and now the trees around Lake Clearwater were showing their first hints of fall color. Much had changed in those months, both for Mike and for the community. He now proudly called home. The criminal case against Diane had moved forward steadily. With Harold's testimony and the physical evidence, she had eventually accepted a plea deal rather than face a trial. The terms included probation, community service, and most painfully for her, restitution to Mike for the value of his destroyed boat. Patricia, who had helped plan the arson but hadn't actually set the fire, received a lighter sentence, probation and a fine. Both women had been ordered to stay away from Clearwater Shores and its residents. The last Mike had heard, Diane had sold her lakefront house and moved to a condo in the city. The beautiful home she'd been so determined to protect from eyesores now belonged to a family with 3 children, a golden retriever, and a trampoline in the backyard. The new HOA board, elected after the temporary suspension period, was a breath of fresh air. Led by Tom, who had reluctantly agreed to serve as president, the board focused on actual community needs rather than aesthetic perfectionism. Rules still existed. They were necessary for any community, but they were enforced reasonably and evenly. We're not the design police, Tom often said at meetings. We're just here to keep the place running smoothly. One of the board's first actions had been to revise the boat storage rule, allowing residents to keep watercraft on their properties with basic, common-sense requirements about maintenance and safety. Mike had helped draft the new language, though. At the time, he hadn't expected to need it himself. But life had a way of bringing things full circle. On a perfect Saturday morning in September, a small crowd gathered on Mike's dock. Tom was there with his wife, along with several other neighbors, who'd become friends. Detective Rivera had even stopped by, out of uniform and holding a beer despite the early hour. She's a beauty, Tom said, admiring the gleaming wooden boat tied to the dock. Sunlight bounced off the fresh varnish, highlighting the warm honey color of the restored wood. Thanks, Mike replied with a proud smile. Couldn't have done it without Joe's help. Joe, the boat builder who'd offered Mike the restoration project, nodded in acknowledgement. Over the past months, Mike had spent most weekends at Joe's workshop, learning the craft of wooden boat restoration. What had started as a distraction from his problems had developed into a genuine passion, and possibly a side business. You gonna name her? Asked Rick, the neighbor who'd alerted Mike about the fire that night. Mike patted the boat's polished hull. Already did. He pointed to the small hand-painted lettering on the stern. Second Chance. It was fitting for a boat that had been abandoned and then restored. Fitting, too, for the community that had found a new beginning after Diane's reign of terror. Well, Joe said, checking his watch, enough admiring. Let's see if she floats. With help from the gathered neighbors, Mike carefully backed the trailer down the slope into the water. The Second Chance slid smoothly off the trailer, bobbing gently on the lake surface. No leaks, just as they'd hoped. Mike jumped in, feeling the familiar movement beneath his feet. Similar to his old sailboat, but different too. This boat had a small inboard engine rather than sails, but it had the same handcrafted wooden charm that had drawn him to the weekend wanderer. Anyone want to join the maiden voyage? He called out. Tom and a couple others climbed aboard, while the rest of the group promised to meet them down at the community dock for the small celebration they'd planned. As Mike guided the boat away from shore, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The engine purred smoothly, the result of many hours of careful work. The wood gleamed in the morning sun. On the shoreline, his friends waved as the boat picked up speed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Lisa, his lawyer. Congrats. On launch day, BTW final restitution payment came through. Case officially closed. Mike smiled and tucked the phone away. It felt right that the last chapter of the Diane saga had closed on the same day his new boat touched water for the first time. He opened the throttle a bit more, and the second chance responded eagerly, cutting through the lake water with barely a sound beyond the gentle lapping against the wooden hull. "Where to?" asked Tom, settling into the passenger seat. Mike grinned. "Let's cruise past the North Cove. I hear the new folks who bought Diane's place are having a kid's birthday party with one of those bouncy castles right on the lawn." Tom laughed. "She'd have a heart attack if she knew." "The best revenge," Mike replied, turning the boat toward the north end of the lake. Later that afternoon, after the boat had been properly christened and tested, the neighbors gathered at the HOA community pavilion for an impromptu barbecue. Someone had brought a guitar, and casual conversations blended with music and laughter. Mike found himself talking with Betty, the older woman who had secretively warned him about Diane's questions all those months ago. "You know," she said, watching the children playing by the water's edge, "I've lived here 22 years and I can't remember the last time we had a community gathering that wasn't a formal meeting with Robert's Rules of Order and Diane controlling every word." Mike nodded. "This is what a neighborhood should be." "Indeed," Betty agreed, "and we have you to thank for it." Mike shook his head. "I just wanted to keep my boat." "Sometimes," Betty said with a smile, "the simplest desires lead to the most important changes." As the sun began to set over the lake, painting the water in shades of orange and gold, Mike found a quiet moment to stand alone at the shore. From this spot, he could see his cabin and the newly built boat shed beside it. He could see neighbors chatting in small groups, children playing tag between the trees and boats bobbing gently at their docks. It had been a hard fight. Harder than he'd ever expected when he moved here seeking peace after his divorce. But looking at the community now, he knew it had been worth it. The sound of footsteps on the dock interrupted his thoughts. It was Tom holding 2 beers. He handed one to Mike. "To justice," Tom said, raising his bottle in a toast. Mike clinked his bottle against Tom's. "And to second chances." They drank in comfortable silence, watching the sunset reflect on the lake. Justice had indeed arrived on its own schedule, not just for Mike and his boat, but for an entire community that had found its voice again. And as for HOA Karen, well, she'd learned the hard way that sometimes the person you try to intimidate turns out to be exactly the wrong person to mess with.